afternoon, everybody. And today I'd like to just basically do two verses. The first verse I'd like to do from Parshas Kedoshim, Vayikra chapter 19, verse 18, one of the most famous verses in the entire Torah, one of the most beautiful verses, which I want to explore in depth, is the verse as follows. Votikom or vosikom, vositor. Do not take revenge and do not bear a grudge. Es b'nei amecha, against the members of your people. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You must love your neighbor like you love yourself. Ani Hashem, I am God. Again, do not take revenge, do not bear a grudge. Love your neighbors like you love yourself. I am Hashem. And that's the first verse. So what I'd like to do is first read the Rashi on this portion, on this verse, and then after I read the Rashi, I want to look at the Balaturim, and then after that, I'd like to look at some of the Hasidic masters. So let's start with the Rashi on this verse. Lo sikom v'lo sitar. Do not take revenge and do not bear a grudge. What's the difference between taking revenge and bearing a grudge? And what does it mean to love your neighbor like you love yourself? So the first explanation is lo sikom, do not take revenge. Amar lo, so Rashi gives us an example. What's going on here? What is taking revenge that you're not allowed to do? Amar lo, let's say one man said, Hashileni magalcha. A man says, lend me your sickle. And so first man, Reuven, let's call him, says to Shimon, lend me your sickle. Shimon says, Lav. He says, no, I'm not going to. Machar, the next day, Shimon, who was man number two, goes back to Reuven, and he says to him, Hashileni kardumech, let me borrow your ox. And the man says, Reuven says, Amar lo, Eini mashilcha kederach shelo shaltani. Says, I'm not going to lend you just like you didn't lend me. Well, that's a prohibition. This is called nikima. This is called taking revenge, and it's not allowed. I would have thought, by the way, I'm pause the Rashi. I would have thought when you say don't take revenge, it means don't go burn the guy's house down if he made you lose your job or something. But that's not what it is. That's not the way Rashi defines it based upon the Gemara. Rashi's saying that it is if somebody asks to borrow you something and they don't lend you, and when they ask you to borrow something, don't say to them, I'm not going to lend to you just like you didn't lend to me. What's the definition of bearing a grudge? Ezu netira. What's bearing a grudge? Take the Chumash. What's bearing a grudge? Bearing a grudge, which is not allowed, is where, let's say, Reuven says to Shimon, or actually Shimon says to Reuven, Hashileni eskar kardumech. We learned this we learned the verse, love your neighbor like you love yourself in the daf recently, but not bearing a grudge and taking revenge.
No, the whole thing about borrowing the sickle, I thought we just did this in the daf.
Well, the daf was talking about a lot about borrowing because we're discussing when does borrowing turn into interest, but we never discussed this verse specifically.
I thought it was this verse. Okay, I'm sorry. Never mind. Sorry.
All right. So so what does it mean to bear a grudge? So again, revenge is where Reuven says to Shimon, "Lend me your sickle," and Shimon says, "Oh, are you raising your hand, or are you stretching your eye? Are you raising your hand? No. Okay, just working out some kinks. Okay, so hold on 1 second. So Reuven says to Shimon, can you lend me your sickle? And Shimon says, no. And then Shimon says to Reuven, can you lend me your axe? And Reuven says, I'm not going to lend you because you didn't lend me. That's taking revenge. What's bearing a grudge? Bearing a grudge is where Shimon says to Reuven, can you lend me your axe? And Amar lo, And Reuben says, Lav. Or actually, wait, it's reversed. Reuben says to Shimon, can you lend me your axe? And Shimon says, no. And Amar lo, and now Shimon comes back to him and Lamachar the next day, and he says, Hashileni magalcha, lend me your sickle. And he says, Halachai, take my sickle. Aini kamosla, because I'm not like you. Shaloi shaltani, because you didn't let me borrow your sickle. Well, that's called nitira. That's called bearing a grudge. Shenotera eva belibo alpha pisha ino no came. That's called bearing a grudge because you keep the wrong that was done to you in your heart, even though you don't actually take revenge. Just holding it in your heart is a prohibition. So this is the prohibition of do not take revenge and do not bear a grudge. And now the verse states, you shall love your friend like you love yourself. I am Hashem. Now here, Bill says, did we just do this recently in the daf? We didn't exactly do this verse, but we came across this concept in, Yoma 23a is the source for this. But we did come across a recent discussion on the last days of Pesach. We came across this discussion about, here it says, love your neighbor like you love yourself, which is an impossibility. And it's not actually the ruling of the Talmud, because we had a case where Ben Petura and Rabbi Akiva discussed a case where a person's in the desert and you only have half a bottle of water, is only enough water for one of you to survive if you split it. So what should you do? So Rabbi Akiva says, you're supposed to drink it yourself rather than give it to the other person. But if you're supposed to love your neighbor like you love yourself, maybe you should keep it. And it's the same Rabbi Akiva who Rashi cites here. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Zeh kol gadol b'Torah. Rabbi Akiva says this is the great rule of the Torah, but that you should love your neighbor like you love yourself. We know that even Rabbi Akiva himself rules that you're supposed to keep the water for yourself if there's not enough for both you and your friend to survive. So we have that apparent contradiction within Rabbi Akiva. So clearly it can't mean that you have to love the neighbor exactly as you love yourself, because if that would be the case, then you would have given the neighbor the bottle of water, according to Rabbi Akiva. So that's why the Gemara in Shabbos, in its discussion, where somebody comes to Shammai and he says, teach me the whole Torah on 1 foot, and Shammai throws him out. And then the same person comes to Hillel, and Hillel says to him, that which is hateful to you, don't do to your friend. So there we see it in the negative. You can't, according to that Gemara, we're not quantifying it as a positive, but we're saying it as a negative. It means don't do unto others what you wouldn't want done unto yourself. So this is just the simple reading of the Rashis on this very powerful verse. So now I want to just very, very briefly, I always like to look at the Baal HaTurim, then we just look at the Baal HaTurim, and then from there, we'll go to the Hasidic masters on this beautiful verse. So the Baal HaTurim okay, I just want to say that this is a little bit risque, but I believe that everybody here is mature enough to be able to handle risque, right? So we just have to try to share it in a modest manner. Baal HaTurim just basically goes in a very takes his verse in a very unexpected manner. He takes it in a very unexpected manner. The Baal HaTurim says you should love your neighbor like you love yourself. And the very next verse in the Torah states in verse 19, guard my laws, you're not allowed to crossbreed your animals, meaning to say you can't mate a horse with a donkey. It's against the Torah to do that. The Baal HaTurim is wondering about what's the relationship between the two verses. Love your neighbor like yourself and don't crossbreed. So the Baal HaTurim says that this verse, "V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha," love your neighbor like you love yourself, refers to the relationship with one's spouse, with one's wife. He says that ha'ohev ishto, somebody who loves their wife. Now, presumably, it doesn't matter whether or not they love their wife, that the law is the law, that they have to obey this. But he writes it in this manner, that somebody who loves their wife, when he's with her in an intimate manner, he's not allowed to be thinking about another woman. So that's what he says, love your neighbor like you love yourself, is next to do not have crossbreeding. Don't be thinking about somebody else when you're with your spouse. And secondly, and you can just imagine how forward thinking this is, he says, Lo yikufena litashmesh. A husband is not allowed to force his wife to engage in marital relations. So the Baal Turim derives all this from the verse, love your friend like you love your friend like you love yourself. So it seems so random, but that's how he comes up with these two commandments, or these two prohibitions, which are not directly, they're nowhere in the Talmud are they connected to this verse. Nowhere in the Talmud are they connected to this verse. The Talmud does talk about the fact that if a man forces his wife, that the children are not going to be good, but it never actually lists it as prohibited, even though, of course, today we say it is prohibited, but the Talmud doesn't codify it that way. And regarding, again, thinking about a different woman, here too, it's not stated as a law, but it is stated homiletically. So he nevertheless speaks about it in this manner. So that's the just very radical reading of this verse by the Baal Turim. Okay, let me just pause for a second, and then we go on to the Hasidic masters on this. Okay, so what do the Hasidic masters say about this verse, this very simple verse, chapter 19, verse 18? So first of all, we're using the source Mayana Shal Torah, the spring of Torah. So first we have from Makor Baruch, a statement about the Gaon, the genius, Reb Shaul Katzenellenbogen, that they used to say about him. It says, do not take revenge and do not bear a grudge. They used to say about him that the angel of forgettingness, there was an angel of forgettingness, they caused us to forget things, had no powers over him, meaning to say he had the best memory ever. In his whole lifetime, he never forgot anything or even half of anything that he ever heard or saw. He had a photographic memory, except the only thing he ever forgot was if somebody ever insulted him or wronged him. That he forgot immediately. So I guess this breaks the premise that we can't control our thoughts. Yes, we can. If somebody does something to us that insults us or hurts us, we can take that memory and go to a place in our brain and imagine it being burnt. And then maybe we'll get that out of our mind. That's what Rabbi Katzenellenbogen, he was able to, that was the only thing he ever forgot. Also, another teaching about this is they say about Moshe of Kubrin that he had a lot of people who were against him, who were insulting him, and they harassed him, and he took their insults and was quiet. So one time they asked him, how can you be quiet? Because this Gemara that Rashi cites is from Yoma 23a, but on Yoma 22, that it says
that a Torah scholar is supposed to take revenge. A Torah scholar is supposed to bear a grudge. It says, Kol Talmid Chacham she'eino nokim v'noter kenachash eino Talmid Chacham. Any Torah scholar that doesn't bear revenge and hold a grudge like a snake is not a Torah scholar. So why are you so quiet? Why don't you respect the insults? Why don't you stand up for the insults that are being done to a Torah scholar? So Rav Moshe Mikubrin explained, the matter is as follows. When I'm going to go up to the court in heaven and they'll ask me, why were you quiet? Why didn't you act like a Torah scholar when they were insulting you? I'll say, I didn't think I was a Torah scholar. I didn't consider myself to be a Torah scholar. We saw this actually in the Daf Yomi yesterday. I'll tell that to you in a second. But he's saying that's going to be his defense. But he says, my defense will be, I didn't consider myself a Torah scholar. A Torah scholar has to take revenge, but I didn't consider myself a Torah scholar. But if I'll take revenge against those against me, and they'll ask me in the heavenly court, why'd you take revenge? Do you think you're a Torah scholar? Maybe you went too far. You're no Torah scholar. And so therefore, what will I answer? Meaning say, I'd rather be accused of not taking revenge and have to deny that I'm a Torah scholar and try to justify my revenge by saying I'm a Torah scholar. So that's what the story is told about Moshe Mikubrin. We saw that elsewhere in the Talmud from 2 days ago that a Torah scholar has certain stringencies that he has to accept upon himself. He has to act in a more pious manner. And we saw this about interest. So in that context, there was a great rabbi who decided he wasn't a Torah scholar and therefore he could conduct business, which a Torah scholar was not supposed to do. And he could charge interest in this manner, in this occluded manner. So that was something that we saw recently. Okay, so now that was what we say about do not take revenge and not bear a grudge. What about love your neighbor like you love yourself? So here we have a few teachings about this. Maybe around 15. I don't know how much time we'll have to do it, but okay, love your neighbor like yourself, love yourself. So they say about Rav Moshe Leib of Sasov that he used to say he learned how to love another Jew from a Gentile. Because one time, hold on one second. He said he learned how to love another Jew from watching the behavior of two Gentiles. He says, one time I saw two Gentiles, two peasants. They were sitting down and they were sitting at a meal and they were partying and they were drinking and they were acting gluttonously. And they were drunk, two drunkards. And when they were drunkard, they began to hug each other. And one of them said to his friend, do you really love me? For sure, answered the other one. So the first one says, how can you say you love me if you don't know what I'm missing or if you don't know what I need? How can you say you love me when you don't know what I'm missing? At that moment, Rav Moshe Leib says, I learned. It's impossible to fulfill this verse unless you know what the other person is missing. You can't love your friend unless you know what they're missing. Can't love your friend unless you know what they need. That's what he says. That's Rav Moshe Leib of Sasov. This is the following. The next teaching is when Reb Avram Chaim of Zolochov asked his teacher, Reb Shmelki of Nikolsburg. He says, how can I love a wicked person? Hold on. Right. So there's another commandment to rebuke, but this is not, I don't think there are some teachings that contradict, but rebuking is not necessarily contradicting to the idea that we just said. I will say about rebuking that Rav Yisrael Salanter says that we can no longer give rebuke anymore because we don't know how to do it. So that's a different concept. But anyway, let me just focus on this verse here. This is before, I'm gonna just pause for a second because I quoted Rabbi Yisrael Salanter on rebuking. So he says, it says, the previous verse, you have to rebuke your friend. So he has a general rule that the word et comes to add something. So what is the word et in this verse? What does it add? So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says that it means yourself, that before you rebuke somebody else, you first need to rebuke yourself. That's what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says. Anyway, so back to this verse, love your neighbor like you love yourself. The Rabbi Avram Chaim of Zolochev asks Rabbi Rishmol Nikolsburg, love your neighbor like you love yourself. How can you love a wicked person? He answers, he says, all of the souls of the Jewish people are one soul. He says, all the souls of the Jewish people are one soul. Just like your soul is found in all the limbs of your body, and sometimes, and if it happens sometimes that your hand will, let's say you fall down and your hand bangs into a different part of your body and it hurts it, are you then going to smack your hand because your hand actually banged into you and hurt you? No, you're not going to make your pain greater. So it's so too with your friend who's wicked. His soul is your soul. So therefore, the reason why he's doing something bad to you is because he's uneducated or he's doesn't have the proper state of mind. So are you going to make it worse by hurting him? No, if you do that, you're just hurting yourself. So that's his analogy. Another verse, he raises a question, another approach from what's called the Yehudi Kadosh, the Holy Yid. How is it possible that you can love everybody the same way? Don't you need to love the tzaddik more than the rasha? How can you love everybody the same way? Don't you need to love the righteous one more than the wicked one? So he says, no. It says kamocha, like yourself, the same way that you act with vis-a-vis the body that you love. Meaning to say, you don't treat all your limbs with the same level of care. You value your heart, obviously, more than your hands, that you protect your heart more and the head more than the legs when you protect yourself. So too, you have to love everybody according to their level. Seems a little bit, it's a very careful approach, but it seems more realistic. So this next one is from Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa. He says, let's go to the next one, to Mayanos and Netzach. So it says in the verse, you love your neighbor like you love yourself. And Rabbi Akiva says, this is a great principle of the Torah. So what Mayanot HaNetzach says, if you want to know your place in the Torah, if you want to know how good of a Torah scholar you are, how good of a student of the Torah you are, then measure how much you love another Jew. Well, measure your love of Israel. That's the way you can measure your place in the Torah. Here's what the Kotzker says about this. This is what the Kotzker, the base measure of Kotzk, it comes out. How can the Torah command you? The Kotzkers are so poignant, so sharp. Listen to this. How can the Torah command you to love your friend like you love yourself? Are you allowed to love yourself? If you love yourself, doesn't that bring you to arrogance, to ego, to laziness, to self satisfaction? How can you love somebody like you love yourself? You're not supposed to love yourself so much. So the answer is, so he says, like yourself, just as you're obligated to hate and nullify your ego, so too you're obligated to love others, meaning to say with totality. That's like the idea. I mean, they're very sharp, charif. The Kotzkers are always very charif. They don't go halfway. Okay. So another explanation is from the Saba of Slobodka, meaning to say, what does mean love your neighbor like yourself? What does that mean? This is what the Saba of Slobodka says. Very powerful idea. He says, just like you love yourself, but you don't love yourself because it's a mitzvah. You love yourself because you just have this overarching love. So too, your brother, your friend, you have to love them, but not because it's a mitzvah, just because you feel the love for them. Okay, so now, this is from the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish, the greatest posek in Israel in the 20th century, and his commentary on the Rambam Hilchos Theos. This is what he writes. It says, you shall love your reacha like yourself. Your reacha is your friend. So he says, now the Chazon Ish, as a background, I should tell you, is he became the posek for the whole Haredi community. And there's a huge divide in Israel between the Haredim and the seculars. And I'm not saying it's not justified. The Haredim, they don't serve in the army, they don't participate, and a lot of them view, seculars view them with a lot of suspicion. But this is what the Chazon Ish says. If the person is a sinner from the Jewish people, even if they're a sinner, like they're secular, they don't observe Jewish law, they don't observe rituals, they don't observe Pesach, Shabbos, they eat pork. Nevertheless, they're considered your friend. I love your friend. Because the sages said about this verse, love your neighbor like you love yourself, that even if somebody is liable for death, you have to kill them in a beautiful manner, in a manner that's not painful, because of this verse. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. And that which it states, this goes to Bill's question, how do we compare this to rebuke? And that which it states that it's a mitzvah to hate a wicked person, that's only if he has been rebuked properly and he has not accepted the rebuke. And now, says the Chazon Ish, we no longer know how to rebuke. And so therefore, it's impossible to have somebody who's rebuked properly. And so therefore, it's impossible for somebody to be considered wicked. And so therefore, we're not allowed to hate anybody today, even if they are a tremendous sinner. And as it states in the Gemara in Erechim 16, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, I would be astonished to find anybody in this generation who knows how to rebuke. And so therefore, today, we're always before the stage of rebuke. And so therefore, there's nobody who's considered wicked. Anybody who's wicked is only because they've done it under duress. They don't know how to act. And so therefore, it's a mitzvah to love such a person. That's the Chazon Ish. Well, the Torah actually never commands us to hate Amalek. The Torah commands us to kill Amalek and to forget Amalek. So not to bear the grudge, we have to get rid of Amalek. But I hear your point that I think there's a difference between the law vis-a-vis a fellow Jew and Amalek, who the Torah specifically tells us to wipe out. But yes, you're right. It's a good counter. Yeah, Morris, you had a question.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so It says in the Siddur of the Baal Tanya, i.e. the Alter Rebbe, he writes that prior to prayer, we should accept upon ourselves, before we pray every day, we should accept upon ourselves the positive commandment of loving your neighbor like you love yourself. And the mitzvah of loving another Jew is the gate of entrance to come to stand before God and pray. This is similar to the prayer of Rabbi Elimelech. Rabbi Elimelech's prayer. He says to say this before we pray, and he says, save me from jealousy. He says, Tatzileni mikinat ish mereyehu. Save me from the jealousy of one man for his friend. V'lo yaleh kinas adam al libeinu. May we not have any jealousy in our hearts, not jealousy of others. Adrabah, just the opposite. Tein b'libeinu, place into our hearts. Shenira kol echad malas chaverenu, that we can only see the best qualities of our friend, v'lo chesronam, and not their deficiencies. And we should always speak to our friends in the proper manner and a pleasing manner before you. And we should not, God forbid, have any hatred from one man to another. So we do see the same idea of in the Baal Tanya and Rebbe Elimelech, that we have to accept upon ourselves before we pray the idea of loving others. And it's so ironic to me, sadly, that places of prayer I've seen in my own eyes are sometimes places of animosity and fighting and strife. And people fight over the stupidest things in the world, especially in synagogues and in places of prayer, and they start arguing over ridiculous things. So anyway, if you say this prayer of the Baal Tanya and Rabbi Elimelech before you pray, I don't think that we would get into fights in the synagogue. So too, another prayer that some to say is that every Jew has to accept upon himself before the prayer, has to accept upon himself the mitzvah of ahavas l'orecha kamocha, and also accept upon himself to pray for others. If you pray only for yourself, that's considered theft. That's what Menachem Mendel of Vorka says. If you pray only for yourself, that's a form of theft. The Maggid of Dubna says, quoting the Gemara in Shabbos, which I cited earlier on 31a, that which is that Hillel said to the Gentile wanted to convert, he says, teach me the Torah on 1 foot. So Hillel said, that which is hateful to your friend, do not do. Meaning to say, you shall not make the Yetzer Hara, which is your enemy, into your friend. Don't make the one who hates you, i.e. your Yetzer Hara, into your friend. You need to know that the Yetzer Hara hates you and he's trying to do something bad for you. Da'alecha sani, meaning to say that Yetzer Hara hates you. Don't make him your friend. So, how do we look at this Yetzer Hara? The Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination. The Rabbanim of Pishischa says we need to look at an image. We need to look at this evil inclination as though it's like a murderer that's standing in front of us with a knife, and he's ready to chop off our heads. So one of the Hasidim asked Rav Simcha Bunim, but let's say we can't get this image. Let's say we can't imagine this image of the Yetzer Hara standing there with an axe ready to chop off our heads. Or let's say how are we going to do this? Like, this is one of the methods of controlling thought. imagine the Yitzhahara standing there with an axe ready to chop off our heads. But let's say we can't imagine this. One of the Hasidim asked Reb Simcha Bunim. He said, the Rebbe answered, that's a sign that he's already chopped off your head. That's a sign he's already chopped off your head. Well, I'll leave you with that. Okay, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address.